it becomes a logistics nightmare, really, to get all that here. I mean, you don't want to bring stuff in the morning of for an afternoon case, but sometimes that's unfortunately what happens. And I think, I mean, communication's a really big thing to me. And so I always try and communicate with the SPD department that I'm dealing with to try and have some understanding of like what they want and what I realistically can do for this upcoming big case.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
All right, Clean Freaks, welcome back to another episode of Beyond Clean. It's Monday, your favorite day of the week. I am your host, Bobby Parker, and joining me in studio is our fabulous guest host for the season, Angela Benson. Welcome back to the show, Angela.
Feels like I haven't left. This is fun, going back and forth.
Yep, for sure. So today's topic, Angela, is going to be on tray logistics outside the OR, outside of SPD, talking to some vendors, some reptiles, as I like to call them in my department. Before we get started, Angela, what's been your favorite SPD insult of the sales reps that come in the department?
Well, we have them wearing different color hair covers, bouffants, and they happen to be green. So, you can kind of use your imagination as to what you can do, kind of grouping them all as one kind, the green caps. But it really does kind of make them stand out. And unfortunately, they don't always have the best reputation.
Oh, see what you did there. Well, it's funny. The guest that we're bringing on to talk about tray logistics for loaners is a guy named Kris Jones. He's pretty active out there on LinkedIn. That's how we got connected with him. We're not going to get too much into identifying reps and rep access, but I know Kris has some thoughts for sure about the red hats and then particularly the rep scrubs, the disposable scrubs that we make the reps wear and all the hoops that they have to jump through. Definitely some love-hate relationships going on with all of those policies. But the focus of today's conversation is going to be on the ownership of loaner trays, why we use them, what a rep has to go through to get loaners even into the facility, how to navigate around policies, and then particularly how to keep track of which ones belong to which company. Are they yours? Are they mine? Who sets up the tray? Lots of questions around keeping track of loaners, and I think we've got the right guy here to talk to us about it. We'll be right back after a short break with Kris Jones.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
And joining us now in studio is Kris Jones, orthopedic distributor out of Oklahoma and rep extraordinaire. Kris, thanks for accepting the invite here to join us on the show and talk to us a little bit about tray logistics from the rep side. So,
thanks for having me. Good to meet you guys. Looking forward to having some fun discussions.
Yeah, for sure. I guess a good place for us to start, Kris, would be introductions. Why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you've been doing in the industry?
So, like you said, I'm an orthopedic distributor out of Oklahoma. I predominantly stay in the Oklahoma City metro area. I specifically do knee and hip implants and shoulders, so large orthopedics. I started out on one of the things that my claim to fame is, I guess, is I started out when I was 16 working in the operating room and covering cases. that's predominantly because my dad owned the distributorship before I took it over. So, but yeah, so I started working in the operating room in 1997, and then through college I scrubbed and worked in the operating room as an employee. And, kind of, that was back when you kind of did anything and everything. So I scrubbed, helped out down in sterile processing, was an anesthesia tech for a while, transported patients, and anything and everything in between. So that's kind of my background and where I come from. So
you've seen a little bit of the whole workflow. It's funny, when I talk with folks, particularly working in orthopedics, it seems like they got started fairly young in the OR. Whenever you can take that lifestyle and kind of the abuse that it takes to get into the rep world early on in your years. And so, yeah, that just tends to be a common theme. Well, I'm looking forward to picking your brain a little bit on what it takes to get sterile trays from here to there, because I know logistics is a big part of what you guys do. We were just chatting before the call about even this week, all the trips that it had to take to get all the trays needed for a big knee revision from one facility over to the other, and the 4 different trips that you're making to the facility to make that happen. I know it's a big challenge. Let's start our conversation at the level of definitions. We've got, a pretty broad variety of audience that listens to the show. And so we very well may have some new technicians studying for certification or just in the department for a few weeks. So for those who might not be as familiar, can you tell us what a loaner tray and a consignment tray are, and why are we using these borrowed trays in hospital?
Yeah. So we predominantly deal with loaner trays. So loaner trays are something that I bring in for short turn time. So like I expect for a loaner that I'm going to bring in and leave it there for like one case, maybe a day of cases. And then I'm going to take that back out and move it to another facility or back to my office. I kind of have an intermediary there where I have like long-term loaners where it's like, okay, these are going to be here for like maybe a week or two, and then they're going to, or maybe even longer than that. I get into some, like, for me being like large joint, knee and hips, I don't really ever consign anything where it's just going to stay there and the hospital's going to kind of take ownership of it almost. That I've had trauma stuff before where it was like, this is going to stay here. This is yours. If I take it out, I kind of need to notify you of that. And I kind of do that with long-term loaners as well. But so like loaners, it's like yesterday, we're doing revision stuff. I'm going to bring in these revision sets. They're going to get shipped into me. I'm going to drop them off. I'm taking them out today. So, like kind of a 72-hour window, maybe a little bit longer if I can get them there earlier. Long-term loaners, and my aspect is they're going to kind of stay there, but they're still mine. And I don't feel like I need to notify the hospital except out of courtesy to take them out. And then consignment is like my revision stuff that I used to have access to. And that would just stay like in a facility, like because they could do those procedures without me and so forth. And so that's kind of the 3 aspects of how I look at instrumentation and it being in the hospital.
From a sterile processing perspective and just seeing those trays on the shelf, one of the things that is confusing about tray logistics for us is trying to figure out which of those 3 buckets each of those things live in. That middle category in particular is the most nebulous. We call them, loaners that live here, because they're not ours. We don't own them. We don't really get notified when they come and go, but they just take up space on our shelf. And that always mystified me as to why there would be a kind of long-term loaner situation like that. Like, wouldn't they need to redeploy those assets somewhere else, or wouldn't they want to consign them here so that we could take some more ownership over making sure they're ready? It always mystified me. Like, what's the big deal with the loaners that live on the shelf in the hospital?
Yeah, so to address that, I mean, I can throw reps under the bus since I'm sort of one, and that is,
go for it.
I mean, some people get really lazy. And
there it is.
and I've heard a lot of people talk before about, reps are really good at doing what reps do, and then they're not really good at doing a whole lot of other stuff. And so, and different people are good at different things. I'm kind of an OCD nut. When Senior brought me into the organization eons ago, I'm a control freak. I have very specific ways things should be done. And that's kind of my way, or the Long Island Expressway, so to speak. And so, yeah, the long-term loaner situation, it would probably be nice if you could have especially with recon, though, it gets into this deal like, are they really staying here or not? But yeah, there's some ambiguity as to like how that gets handled everywhere, even down here. I mean, but I really think some of it just boils down to laziness, not just on reps' part, but kind of on everybody's part. It's kind of this, we fall into this, this trajectory, and that's the way we go. So.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I guess not everybody's gonna kind of play the game the same way. We have our own euphemisms for reps that kind of catch a bad rap. I call them reptiles in my department. Always trying to find the bare minimum way to get things done in sterile processing. But when you think about it from their perspective, it's kind of understandable. Like we put up a lot of rules, obstacles, delivery times, submit pictures or we won't pay for your instruments, you gotta bring them 3 days before the case. And like all of these things we're doing because we're managing our logistics. But, when you step into their world, there's an awful lot of logistics that are going on where they're trying to make things happen. Maybe corporate's only giving them a set number of trays, and they've got to manage procedures across a whole bunch of facilities and getting them from here, there, and the other place as well. So you mentioned a knee revision that you just went through recently, and that's kind of a cuss word in sterile processing. Did those darn knee revisions. And just as an example of tray logistics, you want to talk us through where all these trays come from, what they have to go through to get to the facility and to the back table, and kind of the journey that loaner trays take from a rep's perspective?
Yeah. So like in this case, I had 18 trays that were brought into facility because we were trying to do a primary revision and then we had all the backups of all the things that could happen, the disasters that could spiral out of control that we don't have control over. And so those trays came from 2 different facilities this time around inside the metro area. So, I brought one set in at one point. They came from one facility, and then the other trays were being used at another facility the day before. So finished that surgery, and then we moved those revision trays, the specific revision instruments, into that facility probably by late morning, early afternoon. I try and be mindful because, I work at a lot of ASCs now, and so they don't have the capacity that the hospital that I was at this time was. There's a big difference between a large sterilizer and washer, and you have 3 or 4 of them versus, okay, we have this one that takes, a handful of trays and then 2 small sterilizers. So I try and be, good about dealing with the logistics with the SPD department. But there's times where I've got instruments coming from New Jersey, Florida, the West Coast, and everywhere in between up north. And it becomes a logistics nightmare, really, to get all that here. I mean, you don't want to bring stuff in the morning of for an afternoon case, but sometimes that's unfortunately what happens. And I think, communication's a really big thing to me. And so I always try and communicate with the SPD department that I'm dealing with to try and have some understanding of what they want and what I realistically can do for this upcoming big case. Is that a good way of answering that?
Yeah, sure. And that's consistent with what my experience has been, just working with reps and all these shipping containers and trying to figure out when they're going to come in. I feel sympathetic in some regards, as I say, because I know that there's a big logistical challenge. I also sometimes have a hard time bringing those reps who exist in that logistical challenge into understanding ours and the good reason for those hospital policies and the time frame that we ask for and all the hoops that we're asking them to jump through, or the cards we're having them fill out, or the pictures we're asking them to take. And so, it kind of goes both ways. I almost wish that we could do SPD ride-alongs with our reps, sometimes and get a feel for their struggle, and then and then ask them to spend a day in SPD and process those trays with us sometimes so that we could understand each other's worlds a little bit more. But yeah, that totally tracks. One more follow up on the knee revision and why it's such a cuss word in sterile processing is why in the world, and I think I know the answer to this already, but why in the world are there so many knee revision trays and so many implants that come in for these cases? When you're done with it, they ended up using 3 out of the 23 that they brought into the case.
Yeah. So the deal is it's kind of a Boy Scouts thing, I guess, is that's always be prepared. Is that the Boy Scout motto? I wasn't a Boy Scout, so I don't know for sure, but you hope for the best and plan for the worst. And that's where you get in. And there's been a kind of shift in my timeline, I think, where we used to be able to get by with a whole lot less. That's not really the way it is now anymore. It's kind of like, okay, well, yeah, we're going to do like this small part of this procedure, but what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? And suddenly things have spiraled out of control. And I'm bringing in 18 trays of instruments. SPD's annoyed because they're not normal sized instrument trays either. They've got heavier cutting blocks in them and so forth. And then on the other side of that too, I'm bringing in tons of containers of implants. And it's because people are worried that things could spiral out of control and be really bad. And if you don't have things there to fix it at that point, you're kind of SOL, in that case. And so, probably 90%, 9 out of 10, maybe even higher, those cases, 9.5 out of 10, all go fine. It's the 0.5 that you're sitting there going, oh my God, this could go terrible. And now what do we do? And so that's why you wind up with, 20 trays of instruments and you only use 1 tray really worth of instruments. And so that's what happens.
Have you ever hit a roadblock with policies? Say SPD comes at you with this policy that they're trying to file for the hospital. We were talking about 72 hours, things like that. Have you ever had like your sets not be allowed, I guess, so to speak? Or have you ever had that roadblock where you have someone like myself who's like, hey, I know this policy. This is what we're trying to stick to. We have not actually ever turned anyway, I should say, but we do give you guys a hard time sometimes. Have you ever had a delay because of that?
I've not had a delay because of that. You did a really good job of addressing how that is. I recently, within the last, probably it was middle of the summer, I got notified by Case Late. Text messaging is a beautiful thing because I can show people things now and be like, this is when I found out about the case. I've also been around long enough that lots of people know me and know how I run my business and so forth. But when I find out about something on the weekend, let's just try and keep this as ambiguous as possible because I don't know who listens and who doesn't listen.
Pay attention, Oklahoma.
Yeah, so when I find out about something on the weekend and it's not a normal procedure, let's just say it's a huge revision procedure like we've been discussing, my clock starts on Monday morning at, let's say, 8 a.m. East Coast time. Okay. That's when people show up to work. That's when things start rolling around. That's when I can start doing logistics for, let's say, a case on Wednesday at noon. That's a real limited time when you have a 24-hour check-in policy. So let's say I'm supposed to be there by Tuesday at noon and I'm still in the operating room. I'm not just the run an office kind of distributor. So let's just say I'm in surgery all day Tuesday. I can't logistically check sets that I'm going to be the one really that only knows it to get them there. And so that kind of winds up when you show up Tuesday at 5:00 at a surgery center, that causes lots of difficult conversations that wind up flowing suddenly up to the surgeon who owns part of the facility. And it's like,
yep.
So I'm not saying anything that either of you haven't dealt with. So it's just one of those things where I kind of get stuck in the middle of that, and there's only so much I can do, just like there's only so much you guys can do in that situation. So yeah, that's what happens. And I've not been told we can't do the case. I've been told, hey, we're going to cancel the case, but that doesn't happen. I mean,
it really does come down to the patient. And, you want to have the rules set and you want to have those boundaries. But if you're able to still get those items done, I think we even last night had a late drop off. I think it was 8 p.m. and the case was for this morning. And, those items are you're if I calculated out exactly how long it would take from start to finish, if we, put our hands on those and you have multiple priorities on priorities, it doesn't, for hours wise, you probably get it done within 4 hours, but then you have the shift change. You have to do testing on sterilizers, things like that can delay that process as well. But also what you had said too about communication is huge. I've definitely developed kind of that relationship with the different reps that you see a lot and you get to know them. And it does go a long way, where maybe, at first it may be tense because they're trying to, it seems like, sneak around a little, like I'm going to duck in quick, leave these, this sheet and, kind of duck out, and really just taking the time to get to know their name, the company, and then it really pays off in the end, even with those policies that can't get followed. It again comes back down to, as you said, you show a text message, hey, I literally just found this out. I've had that happen before. And just that understanding does go a long way.
Yeah, so to follow up to that, I think communication's the biggest thing. I mean, there were 2 instances that happened over about a 2-week period for me where they were, they were what I would call disaster cases. And so I had to rent a U-Haul to get instruments and implants to one facility from FedEx. That was that many trays of instruments and so forth. And I don't drive a small car. I drive a Bronco. So, it hauls quite a bit of stuff for what it is. So communicating with like an SPD manager saying, hey, I know that this is what it is. This is what I'm bringing in now. I'm going to have to come back and bring in, like, say, 6 more trays later today when FedEx gets them here. I think communication is a really big deal because then everybody's on the same page. And that just helps and makes everybody happier, in my experience, too, versus, like you said, I didn't just show up at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and be like, hey, cool, these are for tomorrow morning, like you said, duck out. It was like I went in there, I knew I was going to kind of take a beating, even with communicating, and it's like, I'm here. What can I do to help even too? Is there something I can do that's going to help the process, along, whatever that needs to be. So yeah, communication is a big deal.
Yeah, and that communication goes both ways. Our sterile processing department got in the habit of just a couple days out going through the surgical schedule and looking for where loan trays might be needed and confirming that they were already in the department. And those that weren't, we were making the phone call out to reps. And there were more than a few times where we called a rep and they're like, I have not been told about that case. I had no idea. You guys just saved my butt. Thanks so much for that call. And so to the degree that the facility can help with that communication portion of it and just make sure that we're notifying people with enough time to be able to scramble and make it happen can make the difference of whether or not a surgery is going to happen on time. With all of these challenges with loaners and getting them moved in and out of the facility, why, Kris, do you think that we don't do more consignments and having facilities manage these trays?
So I would say that probably revision systems are probably the number one. I would say they're the number one headache because, like you said, they're big, they're cumbersome, and so forth. Revision systems, you don't do revision systems all the time, or revision cases all the time, I guess I should say. And those systems cost a lot of money. And so it gets into kind of a supply and demand. Like, when we were doing revisions all the time, we kept a revision system in town, but I don't keep a hinge knee system in town because for me, that's a procedure that I do, like once a month. And so that system costs quite a bit of money just to leave sitting them in my warehouse. Primary instruments, it's kind of where we get in, like we were discussing earlier. I see those as long-term loaners. I've had those at facilities for years before where they were probably consigned. Consigned to me is something, back to that kind of definition, is something where the hospital manages it at that point. And so they're the ones putting it back together. They're the ones, if it's trauma stuff, they might possibly be the ones reordering those those things. And so I never wanted somebody putting my systems back together and doing that. So that's where I kind of always had them as this long-term loaner concept, which probably functions more in consignment by most people's standards. But so back to the logistics of that is just bringing in revisions and keeping them there all the time is just not financially feasible to most companies. Now, if you're a joint or an orthopedic hospital that's all you're doing, I mean, there's some that everybody's going to know on here that they talk about them all the time. And so those facilities probably have those systems that stay there all the time. I mean, I don't function in that capacity. I have to bring that stuff in and move it around, the revision stuff. But like I work at 2 primary surgery centers. I've got, 3 primary joint systems at each one of those facilities, and other stuff. So, but that's how I handle that part of it. Logistically, back to your deal about, why they don't stay there as much. I really think that just boils down to cost of ownership for companies.
Well, speaking of ownership, is there a way that about who keeps track of who owns what? There is a lot of trays coming and going. Is there some sort of system for you, even with your inventory? You just mentioned you have, the 3 big system sets, different areas. Like, how are you able to keep track of what you own or the company owns versus what the hospital owns?
So for me, I use a tracking system now, a GPS cellular tracking system. So each one of my systems, so let's say 5 trays, that tray has a tracking system in it, and I'm able to know where all those systems are at. So currently we're testing it and trialing it. And so every system we have has what we call a hot tracker in it. And so that system, I know where all those are at. So right now I can go into the software and I can look and see, we've got 20 systems in town and where they're all at, whether they've been washed, whether they've been sterilized. And that's how I maintain control of that. And so we've been testing that. Yeah. So we've been testing that. It's a company called Smade out of France, if I can name drop them, but we've been testing that since the spring. And so far it's worked pretty well.
That is super slick.
Yeah. So how new is that? I don't think I've talked to anybody keeping GPS track of where their trays are.
Yeah. So cool. I discovered it either at the end of last year or the beginning of this year, because I think we talked about it before. Maybe we talked about it during this time. I got contacted about some trays that somehow they weren't my trays specifically, but they were a company we distribute for. Those trays had been missing for 5 to 7 years, we think. They were brand new trays. They got shipped in, and I kind of was annoyed about it. I was like, this shouldn't happen. I made a post on LinkedIn, and this company somehow, because of the hashtags I used, found my gripe session kind of. I mean, a lot of things transpired from there where I wound up, talking to them. It's kind of the beauty of LinkedIn, talking to them, and we're now in the process of demoing it. In a perfect world, I would have one in each tray. That's just not financially feasible for me right now. But I think the technology really has only been available for the last year, 18 months maybe, from this company specifically. And they really are the best one I've been around, and maybe really the only one right now that's commercially ready and being used. So that's how I'm able to track everything I've got, is based on that system right now. And I'm pretty good, about knowing what's where and everything, just because of what we have. But yeah, it really helps to know where stuff's at, that it's sterile, because I've gotten, kind of hosed by that before.
Yeah, thinking that it's there and it's not, or that it's ready to go and it's been torn down in the loaner room. That's a reality that I lived through as well. We had a fairly large sterile processing department. It was a renovation that had been done. We were in a separate building from where the OR was. They built it kind of trying to future-proof sterile processing, and so we had too much space. I might have been the only sterile processing department that had, too much space in it. But there's also this goldfish principle that, the need is going to grow to fit the container that you have the goldfish in. And so, yeah, we we became kind of the loaner that lived there regional storage facility for a lot of reps. I feel like, because we had so many trays that were on the shelf and hadn't been opened in a couple of years, or we had an outgoing loaner room that had trays in it that we were actively trying to call folks to get those trays out of there. Cause it just seemed like if we weren't pushing against that, they would just pile up and live there for years on end. And so one of the things that we were doing and trying to clarify this question, like what's a loaner for a case? What's a loaner that lives here? What's here on consignment? We went through all of our small frag, like implant type of trays to figure out how many of those were loaners that live here, how many of them were consignments that we owned the implants for. We went back and looked through documentation. We couldn't really find a lot of very clear consignment records. And so we had this really kind of crazy high stakes negotiation over these multi-$1,000 trays out in our sterile storage room. We opened them all up and we're kind of drawing straws with the company of like who was going to get to own this thing, which I thought was a wild way to sort it out. And so there certainly has to be a better way to keep track of it, whether through good documentation, maybe through digital ones that don't get lost in a file cabinet from the 80s, and some good trackers so that we know where the trays are at. Man, these conversations always go by so quick, Kris. I've got a lot more questions about technology and what you guys are doing to help kind of shape the way that you're moving trays around. But that is a great spot to end it. I appreciate you coming on and talking to us a little bit about loaner trays and sharing with us some of the cool things that you're doing out there in Oklahoma to make sure that patients are well taken care of and you keep those trays well found and not lost. So thanks for joining us on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And you mentioned LinkedIn there at the end. You know that Hank and I are a big fan of LinkedIn. A lot of big things have happened for us through that platform. That's also how Kris and Beyond Clean got connected. So I'd encourage you to go out there, get connected with Kris. If you have any questions about tray logistics or just have a comment about the show, I'm sure he'd love to chat with you. That's going to do it for today's episode. Thanks again, Kris.
Thanks.
And that was Kris Jones, orthopedic distributor out of Oklahoma, primarily doing the large joint stuff. Angela, holy cow, that was cool.
That was so cool.
That was so cool. We've got to do episode number 2 on loaner tray logistics at some point or another. Gosh, GPS trackers in trays that have some temperature sensors in them to let you know whether or not they've been sterilized or whatnot. A lot of implications there for like how sterile processing relates with a rep of, knowing like when trays get dropped off, when they're sterile, whether or not they're going to be like helicopter mom at the washer, like trying to make sure their trays are taken care of.
Usually SPD is the behind the scenes people. I really like this technology where the reps kind of can hide a little bit. So that way, we were talking about ducking in and out, but it's a positive, really. We've had experiences where people come walking into our decontam like, hey, I need those trays washed right now because I got to take them out of here. And you're like, whoa, we got other priorities and also don't come in our space. So that's really cool.
Yeah, for sure. And there's another piece of this loaner consignment logistics conversation that we didn't get into today that's also another really interesting conversation. And we hinted at it whenever Kris was talking about preferring to have just a long-term loaner situation than a consignment, because he wanted to be the one to come in and reset that tray. He wasn't sure whether or not he wanted sterile processing managing the tray for him, that he's more familiar with the instruments and getting them all reset. And I can understand all those good reasons. Whenever you move into that world of consigning a tray and then it's going to live here, establishing the responsibilities for who's going to reset it, who's going to buy the replacement stock of the implants. Are you going to keep one of those drawers of screws and plates in your department and reorder them? Or is that going to come from an order sheet in the OR? When it comes down to SPD, who goes through and checks it? I mean, goodness, for some of those small frag trays that have got 250 screws in them, do you really pull each one out of the screw caddy to make sure it's got the right head on it, it's the right length, it's the right screw? I know our SPD wasn't doing that, and some reps might. They know all the tricks to make sure these are the right screws in there. So a lot of conversations to be had about logistics of how loaner trays and consignments move around. Honestly, more questions than answers, but it was definitely fun scratching the surface of this one today.
Definitely. Yes, we absolutely could talk all kinds, because I really do think it comes down to as well how much experience they have. Listening to him saying he started out at 16, that's huge. You can't really hire that in. I've had people who have become reps that, just came out of, I don't know, maybe let's just say delivering pizza or something. And they got into this because, hey, delivering things, that sounds easy enough. And they don't know anything about their IFUs or the protocols. So, some of that longevity in the field is where you get that great communication and understanding as well.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know about pizza, but I do have I do have some friends who did logistics, like driving loaner trays around as kind of like the logistics guy for a local office, and then wanted to get into the rep side of it and start supporting surgeries. And yeah, it's a big jump. It's a wild thing to be a sales rep supporting surgery. Like, hey, Mr. Doctor, I know I didn't go to medical school, but you should definitely use this instrument and use it in this way. Like, that's an uncomfortable situation to be in that we'll have to talk about another time, because that's going to do it for today's episode. We'll catch you next week over here on Beyond Clean. Again, reach out to us on LinkedIn, connect with Kris on LinkedIn. Let us know if you have other topics around tray logistics or even about this conversation around loaners and consignments. We'd love to hear from you. You can email us at info@beyondclean.net. But until we talk to you again next week, on behalf of Angela and myself, we'll leave you by saying, keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app, or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.